Hello, people of the internet. I see you all streaming in. Welcome to today's Zoom. We're going to give you a second to trickle on in. But while you are jumping in, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So, hi, I'm Nicole from Oblong Books in Rhinebeck, New York. And before we jump into talking with today's author, which I'm so excited about, just a couple reminders. One, there is a chat box. I have set it so that you can all talk to each other and to us while my conversation with John is going on. So feel free to use that. If you have any questions for John, however, there's also a Q&A button, and you can drop questions for John directly in there. So please use that. I will use those Q&A questions to ask John at the end. That way they don't get lost. Two, this is an event put on by Oblong Books, a local independent bookstore. If you like events like this and you like bookstores, you should buy books. John buys books at Oblong, and so should you. Do you already own a copy of this book? Buy a second one. We have signed copies. Already own two? I'll make John recommend you books later. This is me warning him now. But that's really it. And three, of course, if you are not signed up for our newsletter or future events, you can do that at oblongbooks.com. We periodically do virtual events like this, and we send out a newsletter twice a week with lots of juicy, good book recommendations. You can also follow us on Instagram at oblongbooks. I think that's all my housekeeping. So we can jump right into the conversation. So today I'm so excited to talk to award-winning short story writer and incredible author John Wiswell, author of one of my favorite books of 2024. Right now it's in contention to be my overall favorite book of 2024, but we still have a lot of year left. So one of my favorite books of 2024, Someone You Can Build a Nest In. John, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really adore Oblong Books, and I'm really glad we get to talk tonight.
Yeah, John has been in the store several times, so I've gotten to harass him a bunch already, which is great. Which may give this Q&A a slightly more unhinged energy, as we are just doing it off the cuff. We're
Yes.
having a good time. So, the other thing, oops, hit my table. The other thing is, if our internet lags at any point, the same thing that has been letting people see the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, is also really messing up internet around here for some reason. So if
Mhm.
we cut in and out on you periodically, I'm sorry. It's not us. It's the Northern Lights. It's not our fault. So, John, I could summarize it. This book has been out for over a month now.
That's
So
right.
can you pitch Someone You Can Build a Nest In to us?
Certainly. Someone You Can Build a Nest In is the story of a wonderful and horrible nightmarish shape-shifting monster named Shisheshin. It's very relatable. She can't grow her own bones very well, but when you're a flesh-eating monster, everybody's a donor. She tries to live on her own in the abandoned ruins of this manor, but unfortunately, monster hunters keep trying to assassinate her. And at one point, they manage to poison her and drive her out of her lair and drive her off of a ravine. And she thinks, this is it. I've finally been slain. But instead, she's rescued by a human, Homily. It's a very lovely, energetic, quirky person who mistakes Shisheshin for a fellow human who was probably harmed by somebody and tossed off a ravine. People will do anything to each other these days. And Homily gradually nurses Shisheshin back to health. And Shisheshin, for the first time in her existence, feels compassion from somebody else. And they form this bizarre protective bond over over one another. They just have more in common than they ever expected. But the closer that the two of them become, the harder it is for Shisheshin to keep this secret. And she's just working up the courage, and she keeps trying. And finally, she's about to just blurt it out when Homily mentions why she's here. See, she's hunting this horrible shape-shifting nightmare thing. Has Shisheshin seen it anywhere? And that's this book. Someone You Can Build a Nest In. Classic, normal love story that's not weird at all.
Just your normal, asexual, sapphic, monster-loving, horror fantasy romance.
Yes, yes. I just accidentally checked all of the boxes on the genre sheet. I didn't realize you were supposed to only take one.
You know what? I like it. It does make it hard to shelve in the store, but we'll take it.
I'd be very curious where she goes.
I think
Did
we have her in fantasy, but then she's on display in fiction and cross shelves in horror.
That's good. I mean,
Yeah,
really, the only thing that'd be frightening is if she showed up in nonfiction.
I mean, anything's possible with time. So, one of the things you mentioned is that Homily is here to hunt a monster, but that is because Homily has a kind of interesting family legacy that she is trying in her way to live up to. Can you talk a little bit about Homily's family?
Sure. And how long do we have to talk about the wonderful, friendly Wolfire family? So, Homily has showed up here before the rest of her family, or before most of them. Uh, and one at first expects that, oh, she must come from like the Berenstein Bears because she's so cuddly and nice. And then, like, no, she comes from basically like a nightmare version of the Lannisters. That she, that they view this isthmus where Shisheshin lives as merely a foothold of political power, and they are after Shisheshin allegedly uh, because they have a death curse on them that she claims she put on them. That Shisheshin cursed the whole family, and they can only break the curse by cutting out her heart and then using the blood to break the curse. Few problems. One, Shisheshin doesn't remember putting a curse on anyone. Two, she doesn't remember that because she doesn't think she can do that. And three, she's absolutely certain she doesn't have a heart. Her species doesn't have blood outside of when they drink it from somebody else. So, but it's very difficult for her to like bring up to Holly, like, have you considered skepticism? Because she would then blow her cover. And so the more we get to know Homily, we learn about very different ways that the family emerged from the first time they met, allegedly a monster here. Well, they've obviously met something. Uh, but on the isthmus, their father died, their mother was driven into like this deep wrath, and the surviving children became very different people in refrain from that. Homily went a different way than most of her family in that having suffered, she's tried to find ways to reduce other people's suffering. But she's only been coming into the fold recently because she thinks that her whole family is at risk and she feels like she owes them this. Um, she has some trouble setting boundaries. Really, setting boundaries makes her feel like a monster. If only there were another monster who could maybe set her straight or set her queer, actually, in this case.
Yeah, as it happens to be. So one of the things, so John and I have talked a lot previously. For those of you who read Book Page, which is available in a lot of libraries, you may have seen our Q&A in Book Page already. One of the things we talked about there, and I'm going to bring up again now because I continue to find it fascinating, is I love how much Sheshishen wants to just consume Homily's mother. Just it's peak like it's hating your stepmother to like the utmost extreme. Hating your mother-in-law taken to 1,000. You pull obviously from a lot of genres, but also you're clearly pulling from classic fairy tales, classic myths. It's something you're clearly inspired by a lot in your work. How do you weave it in? What draws you to those sort of narratives?
Uh, it it's often interesting to find you love characters or narratives and then find the opposite thing that is at a 90-degree conflict. So I started this story with Homily and Shisheshin. Before I knew what their story was, I was just in love with their dynamic. The idea of this like nightmare monster who just really doesn't want to blow this good thing she has with the cinnamon roll is just like a really fun dynamic. And then I was like, all right, what world do they fit in? What will make them more accessible? And to be able to play around in a fantasy world, I've loved fantasy literature my whole life. You know, I grew up with Tolkien and a Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, and I took to Ursula K. Le Guin really aggressively. Um, but I saw that as a kind of zone where you could expect to run into Shisheshin. At the same time, you could look at a different part of those sorts of worlds than usually get set up. So I got drawn in both by historical ideas and fairy tale ideas. So like one historical idea, I'm always fascinated by the idea of the microstate that exists between empires. The isthmus, that whole little zone that the novel takes place in, it's a very small place that everyone would love to conquer, but they can't because the second they move, everyone else will move. But that means the isthmus exists in a very tenuous place, just like Sheshan herself does. So that is an echo of like the real history. I'm fascinated with places like Strasbourg in Germany slash France. These places that are totally at the behest of outsiders and of much greater powers that view them as a very delicious pawn. At the same time, then there are the kinds of characters that we often see only one or two dimensions of. So, like a couple of the first characters we meet are Malik and Rourke, who are our resident monster hunters who've been hired to get rid of Sheshan. And it's not like I invented witchers. I think somebody would be very upset with me if I claimed I did. Uh, but in playing with them, the first thing I wanted to do was have them be representative of different cultures than I often get to see engage with each other. I have a lot of Arab friends, and I'm of Irish stock, and we never get to hang out with each other in fantasy. And so I was like immediately like, this is how it happens. Even if it gets me eaten by a monster, I will let that happen. Um, and so there's intersections of what do you love about reality and what draws you to escapism or wonder in fantasy. And both of those things I think draw you deeper and deeper, both into reading and into writing. Is the next thing that crosses, the next thing that feels like it doesn't fit only because you've never seen it done before or done like this. Will pull me to the keyboard over and over again.
I am torn between asking you about the Monster Hunter with a shaming kink or talking more about the isthmus, because both of those are equally interesting to me. I'll start with the isthmus. That is a terrible word for a person with a list. Why did you do this to me?
It's
So, uh, the story takes place obviously in this place between places, and Sheshishen is she's a monster, but she's not a monster, and Homily is this monster hunting. Everything is between things. And similarly, we have the queerness and the disability and all of these things. As somebody who's also queer and disabled, where it's like, oh, we're kind of the in between of things. Like, you might not recognize it right away, but also we're not this other thing. We're kind of in the middle. Um, what does it feel like to navigate that space fictitiously? Because obviously there are reflections of it, the real world, in your stories, even if there are no shesheshens or blueberries in our world. Blueberry, of course, being the giant friendly bear that Sheshen is best friends with, obviously, for those of you who don't know. But what was it like to navigate that space and all of these elements of identity within kind of that in between?
I'll say that earlier in my career, writing those sorts of things into fiction was very daunting and frightening. Because I felt like nobody but me wanted it. And there is, especially within disability, there is a cultural pressure to make yourself invisible. Invisible disabilities aren't just invisible by nature, they're often invisible by habit. You ritualize yourself to not be seen so that you'll be safer or you won't be inconveniencing someone else. But then the longer that I wrote, the more disabled and queer readers and writers I ran into were all just desperate to be seen. And I was like, oh, it's not just me. Oh, I've been holding myself back for the same ridiculous narrative everybody else has. This is terrible. It's been a mistake. I should try it. And I wrote it a lot in my short fiction, but I have to say, in writing into the novel, it's the single most liberating experience I think I've ever had in writing fiction. And that's because Sheshin is shameless. She thinks society is wrong. Like anytime a normal disabled person would be like, "Oh, I'm so terrible because I look weird," or they'll hear my stutter. Sheshin's like, "This society is ridiculous. They're looking down on me for stuttering. I hate that they talk all the time. Like, why do you have to sound right? I'm right. Just don't make me argue. Just think right." And she just refuses to yield almost at every end, which is firstly, it's a fun character because curmudgeons are naturally appealing in fiction. But there's also that she's a curmudgeon often on behalf of the things that monsters are typically metaphors for. And that was particularly appealing. Um, I one of my favorite things to write and often to read is the metaphor for the thing meets the thing. Um, it's just delicious. And so you read the very beginning of the book, you're like, huh, is Shisheshin some sort of metaphor for queerness? And then she gets a girlfriend. You're like, oh, uh, that's I
It's
guess
not a
no,
metaphor.
or yes. Is the metaphor for the thing legally allowed to date the thing? I don't know. And then you have this entity who thinks that she's hypersexual and then comes to understand any sexuality in practice is not being what she thought it would feel like, that sexuality doesn't mean to her what she thought it would mean to her identity, which is a very real experience of asexuality. You unlearn narratives that you didn't realize you were victim to, or that you absorbed without meaning to. And Shisheshin's always thought that she's constituted everything about herself deliberately. The idea that there are parts to herself that she had unconsciously absorbed is very alien to her, because it's the same way when we realize that we aren't something that the culture told us we were supposed to be, which is genuinely like it is freeing in a way. I'll say that then far more powerful than the writing of it has been getting notes and emails from people who didn't realize that they needed it, that it's really connected with a lot of readers, has really meant the world to me. I'm very glad that I made that leap. I loved doing it. Shishesh and Homily are two of my favorite characters I've ever written, but it's really almost better that they got to meet other people.
They live rent free in other people's heads now. Speaking of the aspect of asexuality in Sheshishen, so neither Sheshishen nor Homily are interested in kind of physically coupling, which as somebody on the A spectrum, I really appreciate it. But I think to me the moment that is the queerest in the book, and I get to bring it back around to the other thing I wanted to talk about, is the, and I can't remember his name now because I'm terrible with character names, our lovely guard who agrees to help Sheshishen because he has a humiliation kink and loves to be bossed around. And Sheshishen is just like, what? Sure, we'll go along with this. I didn't know that was a thing we were doing. And it's such peak, like, I don't know when, like, if I'm teasing somebody, I think I'm just talking to them, and then they're like, oh, I'm really into that. It was such a peak, like, ace queer moment. Um, and I love how subtly queer the book it is in all of these ways. Um, when you were writing it, were you laughing as hard when you were writing it as I was reading it?
At some parts, yes. Laurent was. I was more like, what is his deal? Because at first I thought he would only appear in one chapter, and then he was back in like a very meaningful fashion. But he was also like, there was like, are you? Wait, is there more to you? Oh
What's
my God,
wrong
there's
with
a
you?
lot
Why
more
are
to
you
you.
here?
Yeah. And he was such a delight, especially in that he annoys Shishesh, because Shishesh is like, I threaten people and then they do what I want, and he's doing what I want, but he's enjoying it too much. This
He's
doesn't
not
make
doing it the
sense.
way I want him to do it.
Yeah, this threatening is not working the way it normally is working. It's working really well, but it feels weird. Uh, and that Shisheshin is like baffled and frustrated by it, as Laurent is expanding as a character in front of us, was at first unexpected and then really delightful.
He's so
I
funny.
love how many people love Laurent. that, that he I've actually gotten some negative reviews, which I very much enjoy. They're all like, he should have been nicer to Laurent. It's just really funny in particular because Laurent does not want me to be nicer to Laurent. Laurent actually really enjoys it exactly as it's going. Uh, he was such an unexpected but colorful character, and a window into the town being more complex than Shisheshin thinks it is. Um, but yeah. So there are a bunch of parts at which I was like, I'm laughing specifically at Shisheshin's observations of the world, because she's having some neuroatypical mask off situations where she's like, I'm going to give you my bald faced opinion on a thing that I'm pretty sure would get me thrown on a bonfire if I said it. And I was like, I can't believe that I could write a story in which she would get away with this. And that was really delicious. I think I found her roughly as funny as Homily found her. That she wouldn't understand why it's funny, But Holly and I very much.
And I feel like that's also like a peak neurotypical experience, right? Where it's just like, or neurotypical experience, where it's just like, oh, I've said something that I just think is factually true and you're giggling and I don't know why. Okay,
Yeah.
sure, we'll just keep going.
Do I have a sense of humor? Am I awesome? I'm not sure.
Oh, I had a question for you and it's left my brain. Well, I remember the question, a reminder that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can drop your question that I will ask John when we are done. I remembered my question. So obviously you've written a lot of award-winning short stories because you are very good at what you do. Um, and you mentioned that Shishashen and Homily are some of your favorites of all the characters you've written. If somebody wanted to start with your short stories, where would you recommend that they begin?
I do like that question a lot. So literally last week I had a new extraordinarily short story come out in Uncanny Magazine. It's 820 words long, so you will literally read it in roughly the time it takes you to text your mom. Um, and it is called Five Answers to Questions You Probably Have, and it is a letter written on a crumpled up note, stuffed inside of a geode, stuffed inside of your bedroom wall, written by the father you never met, explaining how he knew you'd find this. And in 820 words, I managed to make half of the internet cry last week, and that made me very happy. So if you wanted an extraordinarily short burst, that wouldn't be the worst place to start. Again, it's an Uncanny Magazine. It's called Five Answers to Questions You Probably Have. I'm also extraordinarily fond of the haunted house, 133 Poison Wood Avenue, uh, and Open House on Haunted Hill, which is a haunted house story from the point of view of the haunted house, uh, who is just incredibly lonely and really will just behave, will not haunt you, just will someone please live in me? And it is in search of a family rather than being bulldozed. And I found a lot of people on board into my sort of heartfelt weirdness there. And the last, I think, recommendation I would make if you were thinking of jumping onto my short fiction is a couple of years ago in Tor.com, which is now Reactor. I published the short story DIY, which is about disabled kids who cannot afford to go to wizarding school. And so they are attempting to figure out magic via the internet and trolling message boards for whatever knowledge is out there.
As you do.
And yes, as you do. Yes, if you do not have the levers of power, then you send people annoying emails and create fake accounts on Reddit until you know something. And it is about the desire to build a magic wand for yourself and show those snooty academics that I too can cast fireball. And it is about an element of the disabled experience that I'd never see in wizarding academia fiction. And so I really loved writing those kids. That one's called DIY.
One, I think you underestimate how long it takes to text your mother. Two, um, if you don't feel like Googling all of those individually, John's website has links to all of the short stories he's written. I'm delighted by his website because it's still on Blogger and it gives me a lot of nostalgic feelings. So go look at it just so you can also feel nostalgic about like the early 2010s digital writing space. Three, um, you mentioned DIY, and one of the things we were talking about is John's not legally allowed to talk about his upcoming work, so I can't ask him about it. But uh, we were talking about the D&D vibe it has before we began, and uh, Sheshishen and Homily kind of have that same like that best sort of tabletop shenanigans of like, well, we're in it now, we're gonna keep going, and things are gonna keep happening. One, do you play tabletop games yourself? And two, how do you think, like, let's see if I can phrase this correctly. What do you think is the value, because it is valuable, and why do you think it is valuable, in weaving that sort of kind of like humor and fun into sci-fi fantasy and not just making it like super serious and grim dark?
Sure. Those are two excellent questions. I'll try to weave the answers together as well as we put the questions together. I do not play many tabletop games, in part because dice don't work with how my brain works for narrative, but
Mhm.
also in part because I live in the middle of the woods and nobody else around here owns a board game.
John,
However,
I'll
when
play
I
with you.
do,
It's over.
we did this is the special night at Oblong. We'll do a one night campaign.
Do
But
it.
yeah, I mean, I have played D&D. I played a very tiny orc named Alice Dog because I wasn't allowed to play Godzilla because he was too big. So I made the smallest character I could and turned his name around. Um, um, I do love video games, though. I think video games are probably the art form that has jumped forward the most in terms of its realizing its narrative potential in my lifetime. Because novels continue to do amazing things, but a lot of novels forms have cohered over centuries. Video games have had to like run and sprint forward, and the emotional capacity to touch things like the game like Celeste does, or Return of the Obra Dinn, can do things that like film doesn't do. It often video games used to just try to mimic blockbuster movies, and now they're telling stories that can't be told elsewhere. And I genuinely do find inspiration in some of the greater video game narratives, or the more offbeat or unusual video game narratives that lean into our form does things in ways that other forms can't. And it's the same reason that I love to write, because there's so many things that prose can do, especially in attaching us to the internal lives of people. It's the closest to telepathy we've really come up with. And that's why I love that. And I love seeing that genius applied to other forms. Which then makes me have to ask what your second question was, because I got way too passionate about the potential of narrative form.
No, I love that. It's kind of tangentially related to narrative farm. It's the value of weaving in not just serious things, not just grim dark, but having those moments of lightness and humor and levity in stories.
Yes. All right. So, on the one hand, I am I strive to be a jovial and funny person because I like to enjoy myself and I like others to enjoy themselves. And if we could do it together, then we won. Uh, but at the same time, I don't see comfort where there is an ache. I don't value pain in a vacuum. We contrast things to understand their power. So if Homily and Sheshin are joking around or having a weirdly soft bond, then when some real hardship hits, there's a huge contrast, and that matters much more. The same time, when we're standing, like when you hope that they'll stand up to Homily's mother, when you think that Sheshin is being hunted, it matters much more because we understand what the stakes are. That there's like a beautiful love here, or there's joy in this world that you want to see defended, right? So we derive our value from one to stand up to the other, uh, and so humor and softness and warmth and connection and the understanding of our values, I feel like belong especially in dark fiction, because otherwise it's just a black sheet of paper. It's not art. I or that's how I feel when I write down on the page. When I think about the people who I've loved who have passed away, I don't only think about them passing away. Them passing away hurts me because I'm never going to be able to make them laugh again, never going to be able to text them knock knock jokes again. They're really bad. They were really bad, but they were really good. Uh, those things are in a sort of figure eight together, and they're inseparable. I feel like I'll always care more about characters that have a genuine bond for each other, because then if one of them wants to sacrifice for the other, it means so much more.
Mhm. It's the idea that like there's a lot of advertising for books now that is done exclusively with tropes, and like we've joked around that a little bit, like, oh, it's a monster romance, it's all these things. But like it really is the point that like at the end of the day, it is not necessarily just plot, because you can have the same plot in 10 different books, but it's about characters and how characters get to where they're
Yes.
going. And you're very good at getting the characters to where they're going.
Thank you.
Congratulations. You're really good at your job.
Thank you very much. I
You're very
often feel
welcome.
like I'm lucky to find them or meet them. Like I really genuinely like Shushan and Homily, each of them I could have come up with. I was like, oh, I'm so lucky that I found you both like to make you meet each other. Because they kept compelling me. And because they do the figure eight and they do the push and pull and they bring things out of each other they didn't think they'd have. And when you do that, you kind of suggest to people that their own possibilities are broader than they've been led to believe. And we've all been led to believe we're smaller than we are by somebody or some force, some cultural factor. It's wonderful when art can open your horizons for you.
Speaking of opening things, let's talk about bear traps. Um,
Yes.
um, there's a lot of body horror in your book. I found most of it delightfully fun. Some of my friends have found it truly horrifying. What was it like to write the grotesque in ways that were both like kind of normalized for Sheshen, but also like still fun, but also horrifying? How did you do that? How explain yourself.
Sure. Firstly, you make anybody a protagonist, and you haven't succeeded until you've normalized a bunch of things for them. What are the things they take for granted? And when I wrote this like shape-shifting monster who's horrible to others, I was like, well, she doesn't think she's horrible. At that point, that she's a cartoon character, she's not believable. Which is funny too, because cartoons have actually developed beyond having those characters. They tend to be more sophisticated than that in themselves. But Shushan, like me, like any disabled person, doesn't view what her body does as being out of the ordinary or disgusting. She's like, all right, it's a thing. Like sometimes it aches and that's really annoying. And oh, I really hope I didn't digest all that blood that I just ate because I really needed to use that for something. But she isn't like, oh, the ethereal horror of it all. I am an abomination unto the Lord. She's like, oh, damn it, I needed that. And that's all it is to her and as I wrote this through kind of the disabled lens, which is you don't go around like week 3 on crutches the same way that you did the first hour you were breaking in crutches. Like this is an assistive device. You get more used to it. Chronic pain, it can be very hard to manage. I've had it for most of my life, but it isn't the same. And I don't curse my wretched existence for being alive with it like I did when I was in my first year of adjusting to chronic pain. And I wanted to write a monster who normalized her body, a body that is made out of metaphors for disability, and sometimes straight up has disabilities. Like she has no sense of smell most of the time because building sinuses is really hard. You need to really eat a fresh nose if you really want to smell things. And why would you want to? Humans are weird. Similarly, like she has these mobility issues, and frankly, I've had mobility issues for a lot of my life. But these are things that she's used to going through the rigmarole of trying to get around. Um, One of the first things we see her do in the book is like suck all of these rods and chains into her body to create a skeletal system. Because she's like, this is the morning ritual. It's not like this is horrible. This is like, oh, this is what I do. You know, I've got these wigs made out of hair that people sure aren't using anymore. That nobody's asked for these back, so I've got a great wig collection. And these things are to some degree funny, right? It's like it's funny for her to be treating hair from her victims as like a fashion accessory. But on the other hand, it is interesting to see what she treats as normal and then what she rejects as normal. And so that's where a lot of the body horror slash body fantasy comes from. I love horror. It's one of my favorite genres to read, to watch, to play. I even loved I've loved listening to some horror. The Night Vale podcast was just a delight for years and years. Um, but it's caused me to have a fairly high tolerance for the grotesque. And then to me, it's what is the emotional response of characters to the grotesque, and what do they normalize? If because her story would be disgusting from someone else's point of view, but I'm not interested in othering the monster. Monsters always get othered. What is the world from her point of view? Well, it turns out she others civilization, which she thinks is the real monster. She doesn't even think humans are the real monster. She thinks civilizations and whatever politics is, they should really find that thing and put it in jail. But it's a different beast when you see things through the eyes of a different beast.
Um, Yeah, in hindsight, as somebody who got through the pandemic exclusively by listening to the Magnus Archives, I think that maybe I'm not the best judge of like, what do you mean? Horror is comforting when it's Jonathan Sims's pleasant British voice saying it to you. Fine.
Yes, which is an excellent podcast as well.
Oh, good. Am I in the middle of re-listening to it for no reason? Maybe. Uh, um, I love everything you've said, though. Partly, obviously, as somebody who also has chronic pain, like you wake up and you go, "All right, I guess it's a day we lie on the massage ball for 20 minutes." It'd be like that sometimes. But also, I think one of the things I've been discussing a lot at the bookstore lately is I will pitch a book to like a hyper specific person. Like, oh, this book, like, I'm going to use The Honey Witch as an example, which just came out this past Tuesday, which I'm like, oh, if you were a weird kid who spent all of their time rewatching Disney Channel original movies like Halloween Town, but now you're a sapphic grown up who only wants to garden, you'll probably like The Honey Witch. But
Yeah.
similarly, when characters are really specific, it actually makes them more broadly appealing. Like the more like a person they seem and the less like an archetype. And I think that's one of the important things that you do with Sheshishen is not only like, yes, she's the monster, but she's the protagonist. She has all of these details. And the more you get to know her, the more easier it is to actually connect with and understand her rather than making her this general thing like, oh, she's a monster, but she's a metaphor and she's actually good. It's like, well, I don't relate to that. And it's like, well, she thinks humans are smelly. And you're like, I also think humans are smelly. Incredible. Um, and obviously, you have a lot of pages to do that. But you are, again, I'm going to say it because it's fun to brag, an award-winning short story writer. So when you are creating these characters, both in these hyper narrow 800 and whatever word spaces to full novels like this beauty right here, how do you go about crafting your characters and honing in on those things that are going to make people giggle and weep and cry?
Um, the first thing I do when I have a sense of a story, which is usually having a sense of a character, is ask myself like how much would need to be done to do them justice.
Mhm.
Uh, and I've written a whole lot of short fiction, so I have a pretty good sense of a thing as a short story. Um,
Mhm.
with Shisheshin and Homily, or like the next book that I'm writing, I knew immediately like that can't be done in 5,000 words. Like we won't have even really gotten to know the characters uh, well by that point. Whereas like five answers to questions you probably have, which is the most obtuse titled story I've ever written. Um, that one, I was like, all right, this is a scribbled note from a father trying to get across to a child he's never talked to. Why? Okay, it's gonna be short, just based on that form. He probably didn't write like an 800-page opus and put it in your wall. Um, and then it brought in questions of literacy. It brought in questions of his educational opportunities versus the educational opportunities that he wanted his daughter to have, and that he's hoping that she got by the time that she gets this letter. Um, and that spins up character, but that also spins up life events that must have happened to shape his life versus the life he thinks she'll have. And so that in itself sets up what he'll want to express and thus will condense anything else. Like he'll omit lots of stuff from his story to get the message through to her that he thinks is the most important thing for her to hear. Um, when I've written longer short stories, it's usually like this can't be done in a scene or a monologue or an expression. There isn't an easy way to tilt them to an event that will kind of warm your heart or break your heart or make you sure what happened after it stopped, even though I didn't say it. Just wonderful. I love a good vague ending that makes everybody strongly sure this is what happened next. Um, and then it's a matter of how many scenes do I think it would take, or how many events would it take to do justice to the characters. So the reason that this had to be a novel um, is it was going to have to do justice to both Homily and Shisheshin's growth, not just who they are now, but who they will be when they've experienced a lot of each other's truths. Well, that means we need the story to get them through expressing truths about themselves and then their guardedness and then pushing through their guardedness and both being more vulnerable than is safe because they just care too much about this other person. Um, and so that tells me, okay, that's not even a short story. And I'm gonna let it go. Especially when I started writing scenes of them and their dialogue and their at first especially really weird but charming dynamic of Homily misunderstanding half of what Sheshin is saying. Not understanding, like, oh, you mean you'd like to eat me? She's just like, you're funny. That's great. Okay, let's get you some dinner. And not realizing that like she's in mortal peril. That's one beat in their story, one beat in their arc. And so even there, it is about what will it take to do justice. You'll have to sit with the characters more in the different spaces they're in as they realize things, as they grow, as they test their boundaries, as they try on different elements of their identity, um, and really as they grow. If there's a lot of growth, then I need a lot of plot, and that means that the story is going to be long.
But that means we get nice big book, well, not big, reasonably sized books like this.
Yes, it's just big enough you won't drop it.
Well, I mean, if you're me, you will, but I drop things all the time, so that you're good. Um, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to throw it to our audience questions. So, audience who is with me live today, hello to YouTube afterwards. As a reminder, you can drop that in the Q&A button right down here somewhere. My last question for you, and I warned you this was coming. What have you been reading lately that you've really been loving and want to recommend to these people to buy on our website?
Yes. Yes, if you were to go to Oblong books, some books that I might recommend. Uh, I'm in the middle of Vajra Chandrasekhara's The Saint of Bright Doors, which is which halfway through I'd still struggle to summarize. Outside of it seems like the child of a very unhappy marriage between two gods who have been feuding with each other forever, uh, is trying to create a life for himself in a very strange city that neither of the gods quite understands. And it's got a lot of wonderful, deep thoughts on breaking away from child soldier life and also being pulled into mysteries that might be more dangerous than what you fled away from. The prose is absolutely beautiful. I think this is Vajra's first novel, and it's received all sorts of accolades. So I don't need to be the only one to espouse it to you, but I will say that it has lived up to all of my expectations. I also just finished R.F. Kuang's Yellowface, which everybody has already read, but I've been busy writing books. But it is a pretty excellent skewering of the publishing industry and a lot of systemic racism within it, going all the way up to Hollywood's adaptation system. I'll say the only negative thing I have to say about it is if you were to read it during your own launch week, it might give you some kind of agita.
That was a choice you made.
I really don't know what I was doing to myself, but it was so good that I didn't want to stop reading it. Guy Kwong is really an excellent writer across the board. I love her Poppy War trilogy. Then L.M. Sagas wrote Cascade Failure, which is like a much queerer Cowboy Bebop or Firefly for people who don't watch anime.
And an Oblong staff pick.
Excellent. Yes, it is. It is so fun. It's very punchy. It has lots of good turns of phrase. And it is basically what you want out of literature that is clearly influenced by an era of anime that I was influenced by too. And I think last would be this side, Love by Godzilla, which is a wonderful picture book to read to your nephew if you're not that interested in love stories, but are very interested in giant monsters. It is really adorable. Just a shout out to Love by Godzilla.
I love your love of Godzilla.
I can never get enough. He's so weird.
He's just he's not a little guy. He's just a guy.
Yes. He's just a big guy with strong boundaries.
You know what? Yeah, I mean, that is the correct way to describe him. I'm gonna ask you some questions from our wonderful audience. Harley Fairbanks wants to know, and I also want to know this. How did you come up with the name Sheshachen?
Um, Shisheshin is a sound that I made one night when I was having asthma issues. And as I kept making it, I was like, that's a pretty cool sound, though. I should use that sometime later. And then years later, I made a really disabled coded monster. And I was like, I'm giving her a name that's just disability. Uh, and then I loved it. Like, it fits so hard. I did not want her to have a different name. But genuinely, she is disabled right down to her name.
I love her name because it is not a name you would give a person in like any like naming convention I've ever seen. And so it really from the start you're like, "Oh, okay, so like that's got it. That's not a human creature. Understood." Um but God, I love that it's just like, well, I said something and it was wrong, but we kept it forever until it was useful.
Yes. This is a great factory for fantasy terminology, really.
Yeah, just whenever you make a funny misspelling, just put it in a notepad file for later.
Yes.
It might be useful.
Google it to make sure that it isn't some other language's word. And then if it isn't, then it's yours forever.
You would be surprised at how often that happens. Daniel wants to know, even though this was just released, are there any plans or thoughts on a sequel?
Um, I definitely have at least two other story ideas set in this world, and one of them is sort of sequel shaped. The other one is a very different point of view on Sheshin's world. I'm confident I'll get to write at least one of them, but I'm not sure when. But yes, I have a lot of thoughts about what happens after that book ends. In fact, originally the epilogue to this book was like three times as long, uh, and a lot of that might wind up being the inciting incidents for a sequel if I were to get that opportunity. I love these characters, and I love a lot of their potential for after this story, and it'd be interesting to explore them more. If you are very interested in a sequel, perhaps bother Daw Books.
For those of you who haven't read it, it does work excellently as a standalone, but it does have that kind of open ending we were talking about that you can see a lot of other things happening in the world. And the best way to let Daw Books know that you want a sequel is to buy this one and then like maybe post on social media, but mostly book sales. Book sales tell publishers good things. So if you have a copy, buy another one. Now, Randall has a question. Randall says, you not started, but has already mentioned worked extensively on Blogger. You've already done work that references Reddit and similar ideas. Any work in the future that will throw back to your blog days or the almost lost 2010 atmosphere of that form?
An interesting idea because at a certain point, like blogs will have retro appeal
Mm-hmm.
in the way that every like VHS is very big now as like as a film aesthetic.
Cassettes
And
are
it's
back
some
in again too.
sorry, which what are?
Music cassettes are back in again
Yes,
too.
yes. Um, I always had this idea for one novel that would be told through blog posts. And by the time I was a writer of the level of quality that could get published by novels, blogs were like had descended into the ocean, and you couldn't just do that. But like I love, I can't believe I'm blanking on the term, but the form where you use correspondence, things like letters, like how
Oh,
Dracula's written
epistolary.
epistolary. I love epistolary novels, and I think technology allows us to do a lot of interesting epistolary. Like we're still doing stories that are Twitter threads or social media posts. They're very fun short stories as Reddit threads or Wikipedia articles. Every writer of a certain age had their idea for how a story would be told through a Wikipedia article about a fictional person or event. Um, and I still love this one idea about I don't want to say the character archetype, but telling a certain archetypal story through someone who has no other avenue to tell it other than a blog of what he's experiencing with this person. And the supernatural events that keep happening around the two of them, trying to catch it. I would be really interested to go back and do that someday, whether it is that like blogs took off again or more. I feel like probably more likely blogs at some point become retro and then a novel that's formatted like a blog. And the chapters are the posts. And then, at the end, you'd have all comments that dispute what happened or add context or throw questions about the reliability of the narrator. It's just such a rich space that I would like to do that if I got the opportunity. You could have so much fun with character. Just think the idea of like when it turns out the two commenters are the same person with a sock puppet account. It's just like feel like that great like act two twist of like those two, they never agreed. Oh, of course, it was all creating straw man so that the other one would look smart. Hey, it would be fun.
I love epistolary stories and I love found document stories, and blogs, like blog format things, are kind of the hybrid of both. I also was a teenager and then a college kid at the height. We were talking about horror earlier of many of the like found footage YouTube Slenderman channels. So
Yes.
I have such fondness for stories that are told through like multimedia, social media, even in like that found document text form. So I'm all about that, and I think you should definitely do that.
I
Just so
loved, sorry, I loved Marble Horns. It's like one of the coolest horror things ever done. Uh, and and that's another one of those things where like only this form could do that. Like
yeah.
literally the channel goes dormant for 7 months. Like if
Mhm.
I say the book goes dormant for 7 months, they're like, all right, but then
Oh, we'll turn the page.
I'm not gonna wait
Yeah,
7 months. You'd have to subscribe to some kind of like subscription box to only get the
yeah.
chapters every in 7 months. But like using that form of like, when is he gonna upload? What does it mean that like that there hasn't been another video? Did they get bored or like is he possessed by the devil or Slender
Yeah.
Man or whatever?
Did
Such
he
a
give
great
up on
idea.
this project, or is this part of the project?
Yes.
Um, I loved Marvel Hornets, and I was also a big Tribe 12 fan. And
Yes.
Tribe 12 would later go on to use like, oh, we're streaming live, and they would be splicing in footage to the live stream, and it's like, yeah, it was so much fun. And I'm
What?
sort of sad we've left that era of social media. Maybe in some form we will get it back one day. I don't think currently, not for a little while,
Not
but
right now. I'll say that every time one of those channels uploads like their we made a plushie thing, I'm like, oh, it's back. Oh, it's an ad. Okay, that's okay.
oh
You can do that. But I was like, oh man,
yeah,
maybe
you can
maybe
make
they're doing
money.
it.
Uh, um, I'm gonna give one last call for any questions. If you have any more questions for John, drop them either in the chat or that little Q&A box. Um, let's see if I have, oh, I feel like I had another question for you, but it ran away. What was it? I don't know. It's gone now. It's almost 8 p.m. It's like the witching hour for me. It's where my brain goes to bed. Uh, John, where can people find you on the internet if they want to read all of the amazing things you've written?
Thank you. I am on a lot of the internet. You can find my blog at johnwiswell.blogspot.com, something I have had for I think 20 years now. It is
It
it
makes
is
me so
ye
happy.
old website. I don't even want to swap it out for johnwiswell.com. I just want like the blogspot footprint. I'm on X or Twitter or whatever at Wiswell. I'm on Instagram at John_Wiswell. I have a newsletter at johnwiswell.substack.com, where anytime a new story comes out or a public event comes out, all details, or like if I'm doing a convention, my schedule will go up on that Substack. Um, Basically, most of the social media places, you can probably find me. Usually, it's me sipping like uh, just a Shirley Temple through a very very tiny straw. If that's the avatar, it's probably me.
I think you and I need to hang out in real life, and I'll run you a D&D game where you can play a small Godzilla while we drink Shirley Temples.
Okay,
Yeah,
we
I
can
think
make
that's
this
the
happen.
conclusion of this conversation. Um, and for everybody else, as a reminder, you can buy signed copies of Someone You Can Build a Nest In at oblongbooks.com/John Wiswell. Like I said, this is one of my favorite books of the year. It is such a delight, so much fun to read, but also has these wonderful heartfelt moments. And I've been really enjoying pushing it into everybody's hands. And also look at Sheshishen's little face. Why wouldn't you want that in your house on your bookcase? So again, head to oblongbooks.com/John Wiswell to get your signed copy. Thank you, John, so much for chit-chatting with me tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Literally anytime. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. And we will see you at the bookstore or on the internet. Bye, everybody.
Good night.